He had promised her ice cream if she was brave. But the promise felt hollow in the sterile air of the waiting room. A lie, he told himself, as much as his daughter. The fluorescent lights hummed a low, relentless note overhead, buzzing against the pale green walls that had been painted so many times they'd lost their texture and now just looked tired. The chairs were hard, plastic, bolted to the floor in neat, unsympathetic rows, and every cough from the dozen or so other people. In. The room echoed with a damp finality that made Leo's chest tighten. He shifted in his seat, pulling Maya a little closer against his side. Her small body was too warm, her breathing a little too shallow, a rasp hiding just beneath each exhale. She had been fighting this cough for 2 weeks, a stubborn, rattling thing that started in her chest and now seemed to have taken up residence in her bones. He had tried everything: the drugstore remedies, the honey and lemon, the extra blankets at night, but nothing touched it this morning when she woke with a fever that made her forehead feel like a hot stone. He knew he was out of options. The clinic was their last resort, a place of quiet desperation where kindness was a great resource. As limited as the free samples in the closet behind the reception desk, Leo glanced at his watch, a cheap digital one with a cracked face, then remembered his good one was sitting in a pawn shop window downtown along with his grandfather's ring, he had told himself. It was temporary, just until the next construction gig started, but the foreman had called yesterday, his voice apologetic. The project was delayed indefinitely. Sorry, pal, that phone call had turned temporary into a much heavier word. He squeezed Maya's hand gently. She looked up at him, her brown eyes wide. And trusting in the harsh light, the fever had painted 2 perfect pink circles on her cheeks, making her look like a porcelain doll that had been left too close to a fire. Don't worry, kiddo, he whispered, trying to inject a confidence he didn't feel. We'll get you fixed up. She nodded, leaning her head against his arm. Her faith in him was a physical weight, a constant reminder of everything he had to protect and everything he was failing to provide. He was a carpenter, a man who built things with his hands, who understood the logic of wood and nails and solid foundations, but this sickness, this poverty, was a structure he didn't know how to repair. He looked around the room again, a young mother with a crying baby, an elderly man clutching a worn-out hat, a teenager with his arm in a makeshift sling. They were all here for the same reason. They were out of choices, and the world had a way of making you feel small when you were out of choices. A woman across from them cleared her throat loudly, a sharp, impatient sound that cut through the low murmur of the room. Her eyes flicked from the clock on the wall to the closed door of the examination room, then landed on Leo and Maya with a look that was less sympathy and more accusation. He felt the familiar heat rise in his neck, the defensive posture his body took without permission. He just pulled Maya closer, tucking her face into his worn flannel jacket, shielding her from the woman's gaze. A receptionist called a name, and a man in a Plosser's paint-splattered shirt shuffled toward the desk, his shoulders stooped with the weight of whatever news he was about to receive. Leo watched him go, and felt a kinship, a shared understanding of what it meant to stand on the edge of something, hoping you wouldn't fall over. And that's when he saw her behind the desk, not the older woman with the tired eyes who had checked them in, but someone new, someone who didn't belong here any more than a songbird in a Prossen coal mine. She looked up, and their eyes met for just a fraction of a second. And in that brief glance, Leo felt the quiet, predictable rhythm of his struggle shift into something else entirely, something he wasn't prepared for. The woman behind the Revan counter moved with a quiet efficiency that seemed out of place in the clinic's slow, sluggish atmosphere. She wore a simple gray sweater, and her dark hair was pulled back into a loose knot, but there was a stillness about her, a composure that didn't match the peeling paint and the scent of disinfectant. She wasn't a volunteer college student trying to pad a resume, nor did she have the weary resignation of a long-term employee. She was something else, an anomaly. Her name tag read Julia, A name as simple and clean as the lines of her jaw, she typed with a speed that made the old keyboard clatter her fingers, moving gracefully over the keys as she processed the endless stream of paperwork that kept a place. Like this, barely afloat. Leo watched her between glances at Maya trying to place her. She looked familiar in the way. A face from a dream feels familiar, recognizable. But without context he had seen her before, he was sure of it, but he couldn't grasp the memory. It was like trying to hold smoke. He dismissed it as fatigue. The world was full of faces, and his was too. Tired to keep them all straight. Maya stirred against him, letting out a small whimper before it turned into a series of harsh, dry coughs. The sound was loud in the quiet room, sharp and painful, to hear heads turned, some with pity, some with annoyance. The woman who had glared at them earlier sighed dramatically and shifted in her seat as if Maya's sickness was a personal inconvenience. Leo rubbed his daughter's back, murmuring soft words, trying to soothe the frantic heaving of her small chest. "It's okay, baby girl. Just breathe deep. It'll pass." The coughing subsided, leaving Maya limp and exhausted against him, her face pale and damp. He felt a dozen pairs of eyes on them, a mix of sympathy and impatience. But it was the woman behind the desk whose gaze he felt most intensely. Julia had stopped typing. Her hands hovered over the keyboard, and she was looking directly at them. Her expression wasn't pitying. It was something else, focused, observant. Almost analytical, like she was trying to solve a problem that had nothing to do with insurance forms or appointment times. Then her eyes met his again, and for a split second he saw a flicker of something he didn't expect to see in a place like this. A deep, resonant sadness, a flash of recognition so profound. It felt like she was looking straight through his worn-out jacket and into the very heart of his struggle. He looked away quickly, unnerved by the intensity of her stare. He focused on Maya brushing the hair from her forehead, pretending he hadn't seen it, but the image of her eyes lingered, a cool blue that held the weight of a world far removed from this waiting room. He told himself it was nothing, a trick of the light, the stress of the day, but a small part of him knew better. He had been seen not just as another number in a queue, not just as a broke father with a sick kid, but as something more, and that feeling was as terrifying as it was unfamiliar. The waiting stretched on time in the clinic, measured not in minutes, but in the slow shuffle of feet and the rustle of old magazines. The clock on the wall ticked with a lazy indifference, each second a small reminder of how long they had already been here and how much longer they might have to stay. Maya had drifted into a restless sleep, her head on Leo's lap, her breath still catching in that shallow, raspy way that made his own chest ache. In sympathy, he traced the faint outline of a scar on his knuckle, a small white line from a slipped chisel years ago, a reminder of a time when his hands felt capable of fixing things, when he was a builder, a creator, not just a man waiting for a handout. He felt the weight of every choice that had led him here. The decision to use their savings on his wife's last experimental treatment, the pride that kept him from asking his family for help until it was too late, the slow erosion of his business. As bigger construction firms moved into town, underbidding him on every job, he had been so focused on holding the walls up, he hadn't noticed the foundation was crumbling beneath him. Another name was called, and the impatient woman from across the room finally stood, gathering her purse with a huff as she walked past. "Leo," she muttered just loud enough for him to hear, "some people should just go to a real hospital." Leo's jaw tightened. He didn't look up. Didn't give her the satisfaction of a reaction. But the words landed like small, sharp stones. He felt Maya flinch in her sleep as if she had heard them too. That was when a shadow fell over them. He looked up to see Julia standing there. She held a small juice box in one hand and a thin, worn-out children's book. In the other, she knelt beside his chair, moving with a grace that felt both deliberate and natural. "I thought she might like this when she wakes up," she said, her voice low and soft, so as not to disturb Maya. She placed the book and the juice on the empty seat beside him. It's a good one. About a bear who loses his hat. Leo stared at her, then at the small offering. He hadn't seen her leave the desk. He hadn't heard her approach. It was as if she had simply materialized out of the heavy air. "We're fine," he said. The words coming out rougher than he intended, a reflex born of pride and a deep-seated mistrust of kindness that came without a clear price tag. "I know," she replied, her eyes calm and steady. She didn't flinch at his tone. She didn't retreat. But sometimes it's nice to have something to hold on to. Her gaze flickered to Maya, then back to him for a long moment. He felt stripped bare, all his defenses laid out under her quiet, unjudging stare. He swallowed the lump in his throat and gave a small, reluctant nod. "Thank you," he finally managed the words, feeling foreign on his tongue. Julia simply nodded back and returned to her desk without another word. He watched her go the straight line of her back, the controlled set of her shoulders. She hadn't offered pity. She hadn't made a scene. She had simply seen a need, and met it a small act of grace in a place that had forgotten the meaning of the word. Leo looked at the book. The cover illustration was faded, the corners soft from countless small hands. It was a simple thing, a throwaway gesture, but in the cold, sterile quiet of that waiting room, it felt like a lifeline. Maya woke up about 20 minutes later, not with a start, but slowly, like she was surfacing from a deep and troubled water. She blinked, her eyes gummy with sleep, and looked around the room, her gaze settling on the book beside her. "What's this?" she asked, her voice still thick with sleep. "A gift," he said, "from the lady at the desk." Maya picked it up, her small fingers tracing the worn cover. She opened it to the first page, and her eyes lit up. "It's about a bear. He wears a blue hat like the one you used to have." She looked up at him, a shadow of memory in her eyes before he'd sold it. The hat had been his favorite, a soft wool thing his wife had bought him one Christmas. He smiled a little sadly. "Yeah, like that one," he said. "Let's read it." He started to read, his voice low and steady. The simple story of a bear searching for his lost hat, filling the small space around them. A few people glanced over at first, but soon the quiet rhythm of his words seemed to soothe the room's ragged edges. Even the air felt a little less heavy, a little less charged with desperation. Maya leaned against him, her attention wrapped her earlier fever and discomfort momentarily forgotten in the world of the book. When he finished the last page, she sighed a soft, contented sound and snuggled closer. "Can we keep it?" she whispered. He looked over at the reception desk. Julia was on the phone. Her back to them, her voice a low, professional murmur. "I don't know, sweetheart. It's probably the clinic's book," he said gently. Maya's face fell just a little, but she didn't argue. She just hugged the book to her chest like it was a treasure. She knew she couldn't keep the door to the examination area opened, and a nurse called out the name Morgan. Leo's heart gave a small jolt. He gently took the book from Maya's hands and stood up. "Okay, kiddo, it's our turn." He placed the book on the brook chair, intending to leave it. But as he guided Maya toward the hallway, he glanced back at the desk. Julia was watching them again. Her phone call finished, her expression unreadable. On an impulse he couldn't explain, he walked over to her desk and placed the book on the counter. "Thank you," he said again. "She really liked it. You can keep it." Julia said, her voice quiet but firm. He hesitated. "We can't." She shook her head slightly. "It's a gift, not a loan. There's a difference." She to look down at Maya, and her professional mask softened for a moment. "She deserves to have things that make her happy." Leo didn't know what to say. He felt the familiar prickle of pride, warring with a wave of gratitude that was so overwhelming. It almost knocked him off his feet. He was used to people looking through him, not at him. He was used to being invisible, a problem to be processed, not a person to be helped. But this woman, she saw them, and it was unsettling how much that mattered. He simply nodded, took the book, and walked his daughter down the hallway without looking back. Because if he had, she might have seen the tears welling in his eyes. The doctor was kind, but hurried his movements, efficient his questions. Clipped, he listened to Maya's chest, with a cold stethoscope, pressed her tongue down with a wooden stick, and shone a light in her ears, all with a detached professionalism that felt both reassuring and isolating. He confirmed what Leo already suspected: a nasty case of bronchitis, bordering on pneumonia. The prescription he wrote out on a small white pad was for a powerful antibiotic and an inhaler to help open her airways. "My daughter will get this filled for you at the clinic's pharmacy," he said, handing the slip to Leo. "It should be covered, but there might be a small copay." Leo nodded, his stomach twisting into a tight knot. A small copay could be anything from $5 to $50, and he had exactly $7.42 in his pocket. He tucked the prescription into his jacket, trying to keep his hands from shaking as he thanked the doctor and led Maya back out into the hallway, the walk to the small pharmacy. Window at the end of the corridor felt a mile long. With each step, the weight of his failure grew heavier. He had one job to provide for his daughter, to protect her, and he couldn't even afford the medicine that would make her well. The pharmacist, a harried-looking man with glasses perched on the end of his nose, took the script without looking at him. He typed something into his computer, then frowned. "That'll be $25, he said flatly, his eyes already moving to the next person in line. $25. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Leo's breath caught in his throat. His mind raced, trying to find a solution. That a way out, he could ask them to bill him. But he knew they wouldn't. He could try to call his brother, but asking for money was a humiliation. He wasn't sure he could survive again. He looked down at Maya, who was watching him with those same trusting eyes, and his heart shattered. I don't have that right now," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Can you just give me half of it?" Maybe the pharmacist sighed, a long-suffering sound. "No, it's a full course of antibiotics. You can't split it." "Policy," he said, without a trace of sympathy. He slid the prescription back across the counter. "Next, please." Leo stood there, frozen, unable to move, unable to breathe. The shame was a physical thing, a hot flush that crawled up his neck and burned behind his eyes. He was about to turn away to admit defeat, when a voice cut through the haze behind him. "Put it on the Croft Foundation account." The pharmacist looked up, annoyed. Then his eyes widened as he saw who was standing there. It was Julia. She had a file in her hand, and a look on her face that was no longer soft, it was steel. "I'm sorry, miss," he stammered. "Did you say the Croft Foundation?" "I did," she said, her voice leaving no room for argument. "Now please, fill the prescription for this child." Her eyes met Leo's over the counter, and he saw that same flicker of sadness from before, but this time it was mixed with something else, something that looked a lot like anger. Not at him, but at the system that had failed him. He wanted to protest, to say he didn't need her charity to preserve what little was left of his pride, but he couldn't. The word got stuck behind the lump in his throat, so he just stood there silent as the woman he barely knew quietly saved them. The walk out of the clinic was a blur. Leo clutched the small paper bag with the medicine in one hand and Maya's hand in the other. The weight of Julia's intervention settled on him, heavy and complicated. He felt a confusing mix of immense relief and profound humiliation. He hadn't had to ask. She hadn't made a scene. She had simply stepped in and solved a problem. He couldn't solve himself, and he didn't know how to feel about that. He had muttered a thank you as the pharmacist handed him the bag. But he hadn't looked at her. He couldn't. He just needed to get out, to get back to the familiar grit of his own world, where the rules, even when they were harsh, were at least predictable. As they stepped out into the cold afternoon air, the wind had picked up, whipping loose snow across the parking lot. Julia was standing by the entrance, her coat pulled tight around her as if she had been waiting for them. He stopped a few feet away, unsure of what to say. What could he say? "Thank you for paying for my daughter's medicine because I'm too broke to do it myself." The words tasted like ash in his mouth. She spoke first before the silence could curdle into something worse. "I hope she feels better soon." Her voice, too, was back to its soft, even tone. The steel from the pharmacy gone, replaced by a gentle concern. He just nodded, still holding Maya's hand like an anchor in a storm. "I didn't mean to overstep," she said, her eyes searching his. "I just saw the look on his face, and I couldn't." He cut her off. Not unkindly, but with a raw edge to his voice. "What's the Croft Foundation?" he asked. The name felt important, heavy like a clue to a puzzle. He was only just beginning to see a flicker of something unreadable crossed her face. "It's just a patient assistance fund," she said. A bit too quickly. "A charity that helps cover costs for families who need it, and you just have access to their account." He pressed his skepticism showing through. Julia hesitated, her gaze dropping to the pavement for a second, before meeting his. "Again, I volunteer with them," she said. "I do some administrative work. It allows me to help out when I see a need." It was a plausible explanation, a neat and tidy story. That almost made sense. But Leo was a man who worked with his hands, who understood the feel of things, the grain of wood, the heft of a hammer. And her story felt too smooth, too polished. It didn't have the right weight, but Maya was shivering. And the medicine was in his hand, and he didn't have the energy to question a miracle, so he let it go. "For now, all right," he said the words, feeling inadequate. "Well, thank you again. You didn't have to. I wanted to," she replied, and the simple sincerity in her voice made it even harder to hold on to his pride. As he turned to leave, she called out to him, "Leo." He paused and looked back at her. "Take care of yourself too," she said, not as a platitude, but as a quiet command, and he realized with a jolt that she wasn't just talking about the cold. He nodded once and walked away, the feeling of her eyes on his back staying with him long after he had driven out of the parking lot. The first dose of medicine worked faster than Leo could have hoped. By the next morning, Maya's fever had broken, and the rattling in her chest had softened to a gentle wheeze. The relief was so profound, it left him feeling hollowed out, lightheaded. He spent the day watching her like a hawk bringing her soup and juice making. Sure, she was warm and comfortable. She spent most of the day sleeping, curled up on the couch, with the bear from the clinic book clutched in her arms, its small stitched smile, a constant reminder of the woman who had given it to them. Leo couldn't get Julia out of his mind, her quiet confidence, her steel-edged intervention, her lie that felt too practiced to be real. The Croft Foundation, he had looked it up on his phone. While Maya slept, the search results were overwhelming. It wasn't some small local charity. It was a global philanthropic giant, founded by tech titan Alexander Croft, a name synonymous with innovation and immense wealth. The foundation funded hospitals, research initiatives, educational programs all over the world. Why would a woman who did administrative work for a powerhouse like that be working the reception desk at a rundown free clinic in the middle of nowhere? It didn't add up, the pieces didn't fit. He found a picture of Alexander Croft online, a sharp-looking man in a tailored suit with silvering hair and eyes that held the same cool intensity as Julia's. He had a daughter, the articles mentioned a prodigy, who had taken over the family's tech empire. Before abruptly stepping away from public life a few months ago, her name was Juliana Croft. There were no recent photos of her. She had become famously private, a ghost in the corporate machine, but there was one older photo. A candid shot from a university event years ago. A young woman with dark hair and a familiar, serious expression stood next to her father. Her face was younger, less guarded, but the eyes were the same. It was her. He sank back against the couch, the phone slipping from his hand. Julia wasn't a volunteer. She wasn't an administrator. She was an heiress, a billionaire, hiding in plain sight, and she had paid for his daughter's medicine with what for her amounted to Pocket change. The realization didn't feel like a relief. It felt like a betrayal. The kindness she had shown him. Was it genuine? Or was it the casual charity of the ultra-rich? A way to feel good about themselves by dipping a toe into the lives of the less fortunate, was he? Just a project to her. A feel-good story to tell at some fancy dinner party. The thought made him sick to his stomach. He looked over at Maya, sleeping peacefully, and the gratitude he felt was now tangled with a bitter resentment. He had been played, not maliciously perhaps, but played nonetheless. And his pride, the one thing he had left, was now a casualty of her quiet deception. The next day, Leo drove back to the clinic. He told himself it was to return the book, to thank her properly, but he knew it was a lie. He needed to see her again, to look at her, knowing who she really was, and see if anything in her eyes gave her away. He found her at the reception desk just as before, dressed in a simple sweater, looking for all the world like an ordinary person doing an ordinary job. Maya was with him, holding his hand tightly. Her cough was almost gone and the color had returned to her cheeks. She smiled when she saw Julia. A bright, genuine smile that made Leo's chest ache hello again. Julia said, her own smile appearing instantly much better today. Maya nodded happily. Thanks to you, Leo placed the worn copy of The Bear with the blue hat on the counter. Wanted to return this, he said, his voice carefully neutral. I told you it was a gift, Julia replied, her smile faltering slightly as she registered the coolness in his tone. Yeah, well, we can't accept it. He said it felt like a line he had drawn in the sand, a small pointless gesture of defiance, but it was all he had. Her eyes searched his face for a moment, confusion and a flicker of hurt in their depths. What's wrong, Leo? He leaned in slightly, lowering his voice, so Maya couldn't listen. Here. I know who you are, he said. The words were quiet, but they landed with the force of a physical blow. He saw it in the way her posture stiffened, the way the color drained from her face, the way her carefully constructed composure shattered into a million tiny pieces. She didn't deny it, she didn't even try. Her mask had fallen, and for the first time he saw the real woman underneath, and she looked terrified. Juliana stood frozen behind the counter, her mind racing, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. His words, I know who you are, echoed in the sterile air, a verdict she had been running from for months. She had practiced this moment in her head 100 times, imagined a reporter cornering her, a former colleague spotting her on the street. But she had never imagined this, him, a quiet carpenter with tired eyes and a gentle strength that had somehow slipped past all her defenses. She had never imagined the look of betrayal on his face. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. What could she say? Yes, I'm the person whose family name is plastered on half the tech billboards in the country. Yes, I lied to you. Yes, this whole thing, this clinic, this quiet life is a performance. She glanced at Maya, who was watching them, with a confused frown tugging at her father's sleeve. Daddy, what's wrong? Leo didn't answer. He kept his eyes locked on Juliana, waiting for an explanation, a confession, anything that might make sense of the chasm that had just opened up between them. I didn't, she started, her voice a raw whisper. I didn't mean to deceive you. That wasn't my intention. Then, what was it? Leo asked, his voice low and tight. A social experiment. See how the other half lives. Before you fly back to your penthouse, Juliana flinched as if he had struck her. No, it wasn't like that at all. I was just trying to help. That's what people like you always say, isn't it? He shot back, the bitterness finally spilling over you. Wave a magic wand and fix a problem with money you'll never miss. And you call it help. I call it pity. A few people in the waiting room turned to look, their conversation dying down as they sensed the rising tension. Juliana swallowed hard, her throat tight with unshed tears. You think I did this for myself? She asked, her voice trembling. You think I enjoyed watching you stand at that pharmacy counter with the weight of the world on your shoulders? I did it because no father should ever have to feel that way, and I had the means to stop it. That's all. I don't need your means," he said, his pride a shield against the truth. In her words, I needed honesty. He picked up the day book from the counter and pushed it gently toward her. "We don't want it," he said. Then he took Maya's hand and turned to leave. Without another word, Juliana watched them go, her heart fracturing with each step they took away from her. She had come here to escape, to be invisible, to find something real. But in her attempt to hide from her own world, she had inadvertently shattered his. She sank into her chair, the curious stares of the waiting room fading into a dull buzz. Her carefully constructed anonymity had been a lie, and that lie had just cost her the one real connection she had found since she'd left. Her old life behind the drive home was silent. Leo's knuckles were white on the steering wheel, his jaw clenched so tight it ached. Maya sat quietly in the back seat, sensing the storm that had passed between the adults, but not understanding its source. She didn't ask any questions. She just held the teddy bear Julia had given her and stared out the window. Watching the gray landscape slide by when they got back to the apartment, Leo went through the motions of a normal afternoon. He made Maya a snack, turned on her favorite cartoon, and sat at the kitchen table, staring at a stack of unpaid bills that seemed to mock him with their neat red lettering. He couldn't shake the image of Juliana's face. When he'd confronted her, the raw hurt in her eyes, the way her composure had crumbled, he had wanted to wound her, to make her feel a fraction of the humiliation he had felt. But seeing her so exposed hadn't brought him any satisfaction. It had only left a sour taste in his mouth. He had been so quick to judge, to assume her motives were selfish. But what if they weren't? What if she really was just a woman trying to escape a life that was suffocating her? What if her kindness hadn't been an act of pity, but an act of desperation? Her own attempt to find something genuine in a world of artifice. He ran a hand over his face, feeling the rough stubble on his jaw. He had let his pride speak for him, and in doing so, he might have pushed away the one person who had looked at him and Maya and seen something worth saving. A few days passed, and the silence from the clinic was absolute. Leo didn't go back, and Juliana didn't call or appear at his door. The space she had briefly occupied in their lives was now a void, a quiet ache. He tried to fill with work. He took a small, cabinet-making job for a neighbor, working late into the night in his small makeshift workshop in the basement of their building. The scent of sawdust and wood stain was a familiar comfort, a reminder of a time when his world was simpler, but even the rhythmic work of his hands couldn't quiet the noise in his head. Maya was the one who broke the silence. She was sitting at the kitchen table one evening, carefully coloring a picture with a set of new crayons Juliana had anonymously had delivered to their mailbox. A gesture Leo had tried to ignore. "Daddy," she said, without looking up. "Is Julia mad at us?" Leo stopped sanding the piece of oak in his hands. "No, baby girl, she's not mad. Why doesn't she come over anymore?" Then the question was so simple, so direct it knocked the wind out of him. He sat down across from her, his hands covered in a fine layer of dust. "Sometimes grown-ups make things messy," he said quietly. Maya nodded thoughtfully, like she was considering a great philosophical truth. "Mommy used to say that she said messy just means you have to clean it up together." Leo stared at his daughter, at her innocent wisdom, and felt the walls he had built around his heart begin to crack. He had been so focused on his own wounded pride that he had forgotten what really mattered. He had shut the door on Juliana, not just for himself, but for his daughter too, and Maya missed her. He looked at the drawing. Maya was working on it, was a picture of 3 stick figures, a tall man, a small girl, and a woman with dark hair. All of them holding hands under a bright yellow sun. His daughter had seen what he had refused, to a connection, a potential, a little bit of light in their gray world, and he had been the one to snuff it out that night. He couldn't sleep. He lay on the couch, staring at the ceiling, the silence of the apartment pressing in on him. He finally stood and walked to the window, looking out at the sleeping city. He had a choice. He could let his pride win and stay in the safe, familiar territory of his struggle. Or he could be the man, his daughter, thought he was a man who wasn't afraid to clean up a mess. He had helped make the next morning. He drove to the clinic, his heart pounding with a nervous rhythm. He didn't have a plan, he just knew he had to try. When he walked in the waiting room, was as crowded as ever, but the reception desk was empty. The older woman with the tired eyes was back, her face etched with a permanent frown. "Is Julia here today?" Leo asked her. She looked up from her paperwork and gave him a look of mild annoyance. "She quit," she said flatly. "Packed her things and left yesterday. No notice. Just gone." The words hit Leo like a punch. He stood there for a long moment, the noise of the waiting room fading into a distant hum. She was gone. He had pushed her away, and she had done what he had accused her of. All along she had disappeared. The news of Juliana's departure settled in Leo's chest like a cold stone. He walked out of the clinic in a daze, the world feeling a little grayer, a little more tilted than. It had been a few minutes before he had come to apologize, to try to mend the bridge. He had so carelessly burned, and now there was nothing left but smoke and ashes. He drove aimlessly for a while, the city streets blurring into a meaningless pattern of traffic lights and storefronts. He ended up at a small park overlooking the river, a place he and his wife used to go when they needed to escape the noise of their lives. He sat on a cold metal bench and watched the water move slow and steady, indifferent to the turmoil in his heart. He had been so sure of his own righteousness, so wrapped up in his wounded pride, that he hadn't considered the possibility that she might have been hurting too. He had accused her of playing a game, without realizing she was just trying to find a way off the board entirely. He had assumed her life of wealth was a suit of armor. But maybe it was a cage, and he had just helped lock the door. He stayed at the park until the wealthlike.com. Sun began to dip low, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. He thought of Maya, her simple drawing, her innocent faith and connection. He had taught her to be brave, to be kind, to see the good in people, and then he had done the exact opposite. He had let his own fear and bitterness cloud his judgment. He had failed, not just Juliana, but himself. When he finally got home, Maya met him at the door, her face anxious. "Did you find her?" Leo knelt and wrapped his arms around his daughter, holding her tight. "No, baby girl. I was too late," he said, the words tasting like failure. Maya hugged him back, her small arms a surprising comfort. "I miss her, Daddy," she whispered. "I know," he said, his voice thick. "Me too in that moment." Holding his daughter, he made a silent promise. He didn't know how, he didn't know where, but he was going to find Juliana Croft, not to ask for anything, not to accept her charity, but to do the one thing he should have done from the 20 Brian. Start to listen. It began with a long shot, a call to the Croft Foundation's main line. Leo's voice was steady, as he spoke to the polished professional on the other end, a woman whose tone suggested she dealt with multi-million-dollar grants before breakfast. He didn't give his real name, he just said he was a friend, trying to get a message to Juliana Croft. The woman's voice cooled instantly. "Miss Croft is not available, and we are not authorized to share her contact information." He had expected that, but he pushed on. "It's important." He said, "It's about a clinic, a free clinic she worked at." There was a pause, a flicker of something that might have been curiosity. "I'm sorry, sir, I can't help you." The line went dead. Leo didn't give up. He spent the next 2 days digging, a man obsessed. He read every article, every business journal profile, every society page, mention of the Croft family. He learned about Juliana's meteoric rise in the tech world, her quiet philanthropy, her reputation as a brilliant but intensely private operator. He pieced together a map of her life from the scattered fragments the media had left behind. A favorite coffee shop in her university town, a gallery she had funded, a remote coastal retreat her family owned in the Pacific Northwest. It was that last clue that stuck with him, A small, blurry photo in an old architectural magazine showed a modern, glass house perched on a cliff overlooking a wild and empty stretch of ocean. The caption read, "The Croft Family Sanctuary. A place to escape the world." It was a wild guess, a fool's errand, but it was all he had. He sold his carpentry tools. The good ones, the ones he had inherited from his father. It broke his heart to let them go. But they were just things. And this was something more. He bought 2 one-way bus tickets to the coast, telling Maya they were going on an adventure. She was thrilled, packing her small backpack with the bear, the book, and her box of crayons. She didn't question him, she just trusted him, a faith that both inspired and terrified him. The bus ride took 2 days, a long, rattling journey. Through the heart of the country they slept in their seats and ate sandwiches from a cooler at their feet as the landscape shifted from concrete cities to sprawling farmland and finally to the dense green forests of the coast. Leo felt a strange sense of calm settle over him. He was running on nothing but a hunch and a handful of cash, but for the first time in a long time he felt like he was moving towards something instead of away from it. When they finally arrived in the small coastal town, it was shrouded in a thick fog. The air smelled of salt and wet pine. It was a world away from the grit of their city, a place where the ocean whispered secrets to the shore. Leo felt like a foreigner, an intruder. But he didn't let it stop him. He showed the picture of the house to a grizzled fisherman at the local diner. The man squinted at the photo, then nodded. "Yeah, that's the old Croft place up on Weaver's Point. Locals call it the Glass House." "No one's been up there in years," he said, taking a sip of his coffee. "You friends of hers?" Leo hesitated, then nodded. "We are the fishermen," grunted. "Well, good luck to you. Then that road's a tough walk, and she ain't the type for visitors." Leo thanked him, bought a map, and with Maya's hand in his, they started walking the road. To Weaver's Point was less of a road and more of a suggestion, a winding dirt track that climbed steeply through a forest of towering redwood trees. The air grew cooler as they ascended the fog swirling around them in thick, silent clouds. Maya was a trooper. She didn't complain once, her small legs pumping to keep up with his long strides. She chattered about the giant ferns and the moss that looked like green fur, her innocent energy. A stark contrast to the heavy purpose of their journey. After an hour of steady climbing, Leo felt the burn in his legs and the doubt creeping back into his mind. What was he doing, chasing a ghost? Based on a magazine photo dragging his daughter through the wilderness on a whim, he was a fool. A desperate fool who was about to end up stranded and broke hundreds of miles from home. Just as he was about to suggest they turn back, Maya tugged on his hand. "Daddy, look up ahead through a break in the trees." He saw it, a glint of light, a sharp geometric line against the wild backdrop of the forest. It was the glass house perched on the edge of the cliff, like a silent sentinel. Watching the ocean below, his heart leaped a wild, frantic thing. He picked up his pace, pulling Maya along with him as they emerged from the trees onto the windswept bluff. The full scale of the house hit him. It was stunning, a masterpiece of modern design, all glass and steel and dark wood, seamlessly integrated into the rugged landscape. It was also completely dark. Not a single light shone from within. The place looked empty, abandoned. Leo's stomach dropped. He had come all this way for nothing. He sank onto a mossy rock, his shoulders slumping in defeat. The long journey, the last of his money, the hope he had so carefully nurtured. It all felt like a colossal mistake. Maya, sensing his despair, came and sat beside him, leaning her head against his arm. "It's okay, Daddy," she whispered. "Maybe she's just sleeping." He looked at her unwavering faith, and felt a fresh wave of shame he had let her down again. But before he could say anything, a light flickered on. In one of the downstairs rooms, a soft, warm glow that pushed back against the encroaching dusk. Leo's head snapped up. He stood slowly, his heart pounding in his chest. Someone was there. He took a deep breath, squared his shoulders, and, with Maya's hand once again in his, he walked toward the front door. Juliana was sitting on the floor of the vast living room surrounded by stacks of books and old photo albums. The house was cold, the air still with the scent of dust and disuse. She had been here for 3 days, living on granola bars and bottled water, trying to lose herself in the ghosts of a past. She had tried so hard to outrun. She hadn't come here to hide, she had come here to remember who she was, before the name Croft became a brand, before her life became a series of calculated moves and strategic alliances. She was looking at a photo of herself as a child, standing on this very bluff, her hair wild in the wind. A gap-toothed smile on her face when she heard the knock on the door. She froze, her blood turning to ice. No one knew she was here. No one. The knock came again, louder. This time more insistent. She stood slowly, her heart a frantic drum. Against her ribs, she moved to the door, her hand hesitating over the lock for a long moment. Before she turned it, the door swung open to reveal a man and a little girl silhouetted against the twilight sky. Their faces were tired and travel-worn, but their eyes were full of a fierce and fragile hope. Juliana's breath caught in her throat. Leo, Maya, she stared at them, unable to believe they were real. She had thought about them every day since she'd left, dreamed of their quiet kindness, their simple warmth, but she had never allowed herself to hope she would see them again. "How did you find me?" she whispered, her voice hoarse from disuse. Leo didn't answer right away. He just looked at her, taking in her disheveled hair, the dark circles under her eyes, the palpable loneliness that seemed to cling to her like the sea mist. "I looked," he said simply. It was the only answer that mattered. Juliana didn't invite them in, not at first. She just stood in the doorway, caught in a state of stunned disbelief. Her mind couldn't reconcile the image in front of her with the reality she had accepted that Leo and Maya were a chapter she had been forced to close, a memory to be filed away under regret. Yet here they were, solid and real. On her doorstep, having crossed a country to find her, Leo broke the silence. His voice was quiet, but it carried through the sound of the wind and waves. "I came here to say I was wrong," he started, not looking for an apology, just the truth. He met her eyes, his gaze steady and clear. "I was a fool. I let my pride get in the way. I accused you of things you didn't deserve because I was scared and I was angry at myself, not at you, I came to say." "I'm sorry." Juliana's carefully constructed composure began to crumble. She had spent her life surrounded by people who apologized as a strategy, a way to smooth over conflict and manage perceptions. But this was different. His words were stripped bare of any artifice, raw and painfully honest. A tear she hadn't realized was there slipped down her cheek. She wiped it away quickly, but another followed. "I'm sorry too," she said, her voice thick with piteous emotion. "I should have told you the truth from the beginning. I was the coward. I was so afraid of being seen as a name instead of a person that I ended up hurting the only people who ever saw me for who I really was, Maya, who had been." Standing quietly beside her, father stepped forward. She reached out and took Juliana's hand, her small fingers wrapping around her with a surprising strength. "It's okay," she said. "We're messy too." They stood there for a long moment. The three of them, on the edge of the world, a broken carpenter, a runaway heiress, and a little girl with a heart big enough to hold all of their mistakes, the past and the future, hung in the balance between them. Finally, Juliana stepped back from the Kerr's doorway and gestured for them to come inside. Her voice was still shaky, but for the first time in a long time it held a note of something that sounded like hope. "Come in," she said. "It's cold out there." The house was cavernous and beautiful, with floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out onto the churning gray ocean. The furniture was sparse and modern, covered in white sheets like ghosts, waiting for a party that had been canceled years ago. It was the kind of place that was designed to be looked at, not lived in a monument to wealth and isolation. Leo walked through the space slowly, his work boots echoing on the polished concrete floors. He ran a hand over a sleek marble countertop, feeling the cold, unyielding stone beneath his fingers. This was her world, a place of stark beauty and silent loneliness. It was a world he couldn't even begin to comprehend. Maya, however, was unfazed. She explored with a child's fearless curiosity, peering into empty rooms and tracing the patterns in the thick wool rugs. She didn't see the emptiness, she just saw a big house that needed to be filled. Juliana watched them, her arms wrapped around herself as if she were trying to hold herself together. She had built a fire in the large stone fireplace, and the flames cast a warm, flickering light that pushed back against the house's sterile chill. "I haven't had guests here in a very long time," she said, her voice quiet in the vast space. I don't even know if there's food in the pantry." "Don't worry about that," Leo said. He set the small cooler he'd carried all this way on the kitchen counter. "I came prepared." He pulled out a loaf of bread, a jar of peanut butter, and a slightly bruised apple. It wasn't much, but it was all they had. Juliana looked at the humble offering, and a small, sad smile touched her lips. "You came all this way, and you brought us dinner. I didn't know if you'd let us in," he said. Honestly, he started making sandwiches, his movements sure and practiced in the unfamiliar kitchen. Juliana came and stood beside him, watching his calloused hands work the bread. "It's a beautiful house," he said after a moment. "It's a lonely house," she replied. "It was my father's escape," he thought. "If he built something perfect enough, it would keep the world out. I think it just kept him in," she said, her voice barely a whisper. They ate their sandwiches sitting on the floor in front of the fire. The wind howled outside, but inside, a fragile warmth was beginning to grow. It wasn't just the fire, it was the shared silence, the unspoken forgiveness, the quiet understanding that they were all just a little bit broken, and maybe that was okay. Maybe they could start to be broken together later that night. After Maya had fallen asleep on a pile of cashmere blankets Juliana had pulled from a closet, her small body curled up with the bear still tucked under her arm. Leo stood by the vast window, watching the waves crash against the rocks below. The storm outside had picked up, mirroring the one that had been raging inside him for weeks. Juliana came and stood beside him, her reflection a faint ghost in the dark glass. They didn't speak for a long time. Just watched the raw power of the ocean, a force that didn't care about money or pride or broken hearts. "What happens now?" he asked finally, the question hanging between them like a fragile thread. "I don't." "You know?" she answered. "Honestly, I spent so long running from my life I don't know how to go back, and I don't know if I want to." Leo turned to face her, his expression serious in the firelight. "You don't have to go back to that," he said. "But you can't stay here either. This place, this house. It's not a home, it's a mausoleum." She flinched at his words, but she didn't deny them. "You're right," she said. "I came here to find something to remember who I was, but all I found were ghosts. What if you stopped looking back?" he asked. "What if you started looking forward?" Juliana looked at him, her eyes searching his face for the answer she so desperately needed. "And what's forward?" "I don't know," he admitted, "but I think it starts with us." He reached out and took her hand, his rough fingers lacing through hers. The touch was electric, a jolt of warmth that traveled straight to her heart. "I'm not a prince in a fairy tale, Juliana. I'm a broke carpenter with a mountain of debt and a daughter who deserves more than I can give her." "I'm not looking for a prince," she whispered. "I'm looking for a reason to stay." He squeezed her hand gently. "Then, maybe we can be each other's reason." They stayed at the glass house for 3 more days. A strange and beautiful pocket of time suspended between the world they had left and the one they had yet to build. The storm outside eventually passed, leaving behind a sky so clear and blue it hurt to look at. They spent their days walking on the beach, Maya collecting shells and chasing sandpipers, Leo teaching her how to skip stones across the calm surface of the tide pools. Juliana watched them, her camera, for once, forgotten a quiet smile playing on her lips. She was learning to breathe again, to exist in the moment without analyzing it or planning her next move. She and Leo talked for hours, sitting by the fire long after Maya had gone to sleep. She told him about the pressure of her family, the betrayal that had finally broken her, the suffocating weight of a legacy she had never asked for. He told her about his wife, about their dreams of a small house with a big garden, about the grief that had hollowed him out and the love for his daughter that had filled him back up. They were two people from different universes, but their stories were woven with the same threads of loss and survival and a deep yearning for something real. One afternoon, while Leo and Maya were down on the later beach, Juliana went into the office, a sleek minimalist room she hadn't entered since she arrived. She sat down at the large glass desk and turned on the satellite phone. It crackled to life, and she dialed a number she knew by heart. A man with a brisk professional voice answered. "Croft Foundation. How can I help you?" "It's Juliana," she said, her voice steady. She listened for a moment, then began to speak. Her tone was no longer that of a runaway. It was the voice of a leader, a woman who had found her purpose, not in a boardroom, but on a desolate stretch of coast, with a man who had shown her what it meant to build something that mattered. She wasn't going back to her old life. She was going to build a new one. And she was going to start by tearing down the walls of the foundation that bore her name and rebuilding it into something that helped people, not for tax breaks or good press, but because it was the right thing to do. When she hung up the phone, she felt a lightness she hadn't felt in years. She had found her way forward, and it wasn't a path she was going to walk alone. The journey back was different from the one that had brought them there. They didn't take the bus this time. Juliana had arranged for a car, a comfortable but unassuming SUV, that hummed quietly as it ate up the miles. They drove back through the same landscapes. But Leo saw them differently. Now not as obstacles to be endured, but as part of a story that was still being written. They stopped at small roadside diners and ate pancakes and burgers, laughing as Maya recounted their beach adventures to any waitress who would listen. Juliana seemed to shed a layer of her old self with each passing mile. She traded her designer sweaters for soft flannel shirts she had found in a dusty closet in the glass house. She wore her hair in a loose ponytail, and her face, free of makeup, looked younger and more vibrant than Leo had ever seen it. When they finally arrived back in the city, it felt both familiar and foreign. The noise, the grit, the relentless energy of it all seemed harsher. Now, after the quiet of the coast, Juliana didn't take them back to Leo's small, cramped apartment. Instead, she drove to a quiet, tree-lined street in a neighborhood he had only ever passed through before she pulled up in front of a modest two-story house with a wide front porch and a small, overgrown garden. "What is this place?" Leo asked. She turned off the engine and looked at him, her expression a mix of nervousness and hope. "It's ours," she said, "if you want it." He stared at her, speechless. She went on quickly. "I bought it through the foundation. It's a new initiative. I'm starting providing affordable housing for families who are getting back on their feet. You'd be the first tenant. The rent is based on what you can afford, and the downstairs has a perfect space for a workshop." Leo was still trying to process her words. This wasn't a penthouse or a mansion. It was a home, a real home, with a tire swing hanging from an old oak tree in the backyard. "I don't know what to say," he finally managed. "Then don't say anything," she said. "Just come see it." Maya was already out of the car, running up the front path, her laughter echoing in the quiet afternoon air. Leo followed her, and Juliana walking into a future he had never dared to imagine, a future where a home wasn't something he had to fight for, but something he was invited into, a future where kindness wasn't a transaction, but a foundation. And as he stepped across the threshold, he knew he wasn't just entering a house. He was finally coming home. The first few weeks in the new house were a whirlwind of activity and adjustment. The place had good bones, but it had been empty for a while, and it needed the touch of a family to bring it back to life. Leo got to work immediately. Turning the spacious basement into the workshop he had always dreamed of, he set up his new tools Juliana had insisted on. Replacing the ones he'd sold, and the familiar scent of sawdust soon filled the air, a scent that for him was synonymous with purpose and creation. Juliana, for her part, threw herself into making the house a home. She painted walls, planted a vegetable garden in the backyard, and spent hours with Maya decorating her new room. They chose a soft sky blue for the walls and hung glow-in-the-dark stars on the ceiling, just like the ones she'd had in their old apartment. It was a small detail, but it was one that mattered, one that said, this new life wasn't about erasing the old one, but about building upon it. They fell into a comfortable rhythm, a domesticity that felt both brand new and deeply familiar. They cooked dinner together, their movements a clumsy but happy dance in the spacious kitchen. They sat on the porch in the evenings, watching the sunset and talking about everything and nothing. They were learning how to be a family, not one born of blood, but one forged in shared struggle and a stubborn belief in second chances. One night, Leo found Juliana in the living room, sitting on the floor, surrounded by blueprints and financial reports. The life she had run from had a way of finding her, but now she faced it with a new sense of clarity and control. She was restructuring the Croft Foundation from the ground up, dismantling the cold corporate philanthropy of her father and replacing it with a model based on direct community impact and sustainable support. She was using her power not to build an empire, but to build bridges. Leo sat down beside her and looked at the papers. "What's all this?" he asked. She pointed to a set of plans. "It's a new project, a series of community clinics, like the one where we met, but fully funded, staffed with people who are paid a living wage, and designed to treat everyone with dignity, regardless of their ability to pay. And I want you to head the construction." He looked at her, surprised me. "But I'm just a carpenter. You're a builder, Leo." She said, "You know how to create things that last, things with integrity? That's what this needs." He looked at the plans, at her face, glowing in the Morse lamplight, and for the width. First time, in a very long time, he saw a future that was not only stable but bright, a future he was going to build with his own two hands, right alongside the woman he loved. The ribbon they used for the grand opening wasn't a ribbon at all. It was a length of yellow construction tape stretched across the entrance of the newly built Community Health Center. The building was clean and bright, with wide windows that let in the sunlight and a waiting room filled with comfortable chairs and walls adorned with colorful artwork made by local children. It was a place designed for healing, not just of the body, but of the spirit. A crowd had gathered for the dedication, reporters, community leaders, families who had already benefited from the foundation's new initiatives. Juliana stood at the podium, not in a power suit, but in a simple dress, her hair pulled back, her face open and honest. She spoke not of balance sheets or donor relations, but of dignity, of the right to be cared for, and of the man who had taught her what true strength looked like. When she was finished, she didn't call a politician or a board member to cut the tape. She called for Leo, and Maya. Leo stood beside her, his hand finding hers, as Maya proudly snipped the yellow tape with a pair of oversized ceremonial scissors. The crowd applauded, and this time the sound didn't feel like a threat. It felt like a celebration. Later that evening, the quota Brably rotored. 3 of them sat on the porch of their home, the sounds of the neighborhood settling into a peaceful quiet. Maya was asleep in the tire, swing her head pillowed on her favorite bear. Leo had his arm around Juliana, her head resting on his shoulder. The new clinic was just a few blocks away, its lights a warm beacon in the gathering dusk. "You did a good thing today," he said. She smiled, leaning into him. "We did a good thing," she replied. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the stars begin to appear in the darkening sky. It had been a long and winding road, a journey that had taken them from the depths of despair to this quiet moment of peace. They had found each other in the most unlikely of places, a broken carpenter and a runaway heiress. And together, they had built something beautiful, something real, something that would last, because they had built it on a foundation of kindness, integrity, and a love that was strong enough to bridge any distance and heal any wound. And as the first star of the evening twinkled into view, they both knew they were finally exactly where they were supposed to be, home.